The Sabu Disk, a 5,000-year-old stone wheel discovered in tomb 3111 at Saqqara, has an aerodynamic profile uncannily close to a modern centrifugal pump impeller. Three curved blades sweep from a central hub in near-perfect symmetry, shaped as if they're meant to control fluid flow the same way engineers design turbines today. But this object dates to around 3000 BCE, thousands of years before the standard story says anyone understood rotary mechanics or fluid dynamics. Show its outline to a modern engineer, and many will say the same thing. Those blade angles don't look decorative, they look functional. Designed to move something, air, water, pressure. And it's carved from schist, a fragile metamorphic stone that splits like pages in a book. One wrong strike and the entire piece shatters. Yet someone in the first dynasty carved three matching veins, each tapering down toward just a couple of millimeters thick, using tools we're told were little more than copper chisels and stone hammers. How does a small, early tomb contain precision geometry that feels like it belongs in an industrial workshop? And if this is what Walter Emery pulled from a modest official's grave in 1936, what might be hiding inside the grandest monuments on the plateau? Welcome to the Nocturne History, where mystery meets the edge of sleep. Tonight, we drift through ancient Egypt's hidden technology, from impossible artifacts to monuments that behave like machines. Whether you're here to learn or to let your mind wander into dreams, settle in. We're about to trace a path from this single broken disc to structures where stone itself begins to sing. Picture the scene. Saqqara, on the desert edge north of the Step Pyramid. Tomb 3111 belonged to a high official of the First Dynasty, around 3000 BCE. Among ordinary grave goods, bowls, jars, small offerings, Emery found this disc in three broken pieces. Almost everything else was easy to classify: simple, practical, familiar. The disc was not. If this is what turns up in a modest rock-cut tomb, what might be hiding in the grandest monuments on the plateau? The material adds another layer of strangeness. The disc is carved from a fragile stone called metasiltstone or schist, a rock that splits along layers. The central hub is thick, but the three curved wings taper to just a few millimeters. One slip of the tool and the piece would shatter. It feels less like a casual ritual object and more like someone chasing a very specific result. If this were just a symbolic plate, why risk such a delicate, complex shape when a simple bowl would be easier and safer? Over the years, explanations have been proposed and quietly abandoned. A vase stand, an incense burner, a ritual tray for oils. On paper, these sound neat, but when you actually look at the form, they start to fall apart. The lobes are too thin to hold weight, the hub too narrow to support a large vessel, and nothing about the shape screams bowl accessory. If this was just decoration, why design it with a geometry that feels like it's meant to move something, not display it? That's where modern engineers enter the story. Show the Sabu Disk to someone who works with pumps or turbines, and many say the same thing. Those three curved blades look like veins designed to make a fluid spin. In a centrifugal pump, curved veins fling water or air outward as the impeller rotates. Yet here we have a stone object from around 3000 BCE echoing that same logic. Is this just a visual coincidence or an ancient attempt at controlling flow and pressure long before metals and motors? Skeptics argue that we're projecting modern ideas onto an ancient artifact, that it's simply an oddly shaped offering tray or a symbol of something we no longer understand. Yet the geometry says otherwise: blades evenly spaced, curvature consistent, a central hub defined as if meant to take a shaft. If it was only symbolic, why chase a form that lines up so well with modern engineering principles? And if it really is just ritual, why does it look so much like a component that could spin inside a machine? Now consider the control required to carve it. To get that symmetry in brittle stone, you need more than a vague eye for shape. You need measurement, repetition, a way to compare one lobe to another. Some researchers suggest simple lathes or rotary tools in ancient Egypt, pointing to drill cores and circular cuts elsewhere. If they did have basic rotary technology, the Sabu Disk might be a rare survivor of objects normally made in metal or wood, materials that don't last 5,000 years in the ground. If that's the case, how many other impossible designs have vanished, leaving this single fragment as their only witness? If that's true, then this single disk doesn't just raise questions about one tomb. It challenges accepted history about what kind of experimental, mechanical thinking was happening at the dawn of Egyptian civilization. Why isn't this taught alongside the familiar story of pyramids and pharaohs? When an object like this exists, how comfortable can we be with a timeline that treats the first dynasty as a simple beginning? There is another possibility, one that many scholars quietly dismiss. Maybe the Sabu Disk isn't an isolated puzzle, but a surviving clue to a broader tradition of designing with flows and forces, water, air, vibration, that once existed in Egypt and was later folded into ritual. If one object can look this much like a machine part, what happens when we stop seeing Egypt's monuments as static and start asking how they behave? Because as strange as this disk is, it's small. It fits into two hands. Not far from Saqqara stands something far bigger, a structure made from about 2.3 million stone blocks, weighing around 6 million tons. And inside that giant mass of limestone and granite, there are rooms and passages where sound itself begins to act in unexpected ways. So as we leave Tomb 3111 and its impossible disk behind, follow that sense of unease to the north. The next stop is a narrow passageway climbing into the heart of the Great Pyramid, where a single human voice can wake something deep in the stone and turn an ancient monument into a kind of resonant machine. Around 2500 BCE, deep inside a pyramid built from more than 2 million stone blocks, people noticed something that shouldn't happen inside a tomb. If you hum a note around 430 to 440 hertz in the king's chamber, the whole room begins to vibrate with you. A single human voice can wake a resonance that rolls through hundreds of tons of granite. No speakers, no instruments, just stone and sound building on each other until it feels like the room is singing back. The chamber is simple on paper, about 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, 5 meters high, lined with granite from distant quarries. Yet when a steady note is held near the center, the sound doesn't fade. It thickens, wraps around the listener, and seems to hang in the air. How does a burial chamber end up acting like a tuned device? Acoustic engineers who've measured the room have found several resonant modes, frequencies at which sound lingers and strengthens instead of dying away. One sits close to the standard musical A, around 440 hertz. Another falls lower, a deep hum you feel more than you hear. In some tests, even the sarcophagus responds, ringing like a stone bell when struck, as if box and chamber are locked into the same pattern. For a moment, the entire space behaves like a single instrument. If this were any random stone room, you might shrug and move on. But this room sits at the heart of one of the most precisely built structures on Earth. At what point does coincidence start to feel like design? Skeptics argue that any enclosed space has resonant frequencies, and they're right. Your bathroom, your car, even a cardboard box can amplify certain tones. But most rooms weren't built to last 4,500 years from carefully cut granite slabs weighing tens of tons, locked together at tight angles. The king's chamber is not an accident of drywall and luck. It's a carefully engineered cavity buried high inside the pyramid, supported by heavy granite beams. The chamber's dimensions could have drifted by a few centimeters during construction without anyone outside ever knowing, yet they land right in the range that produces strong, predictable resonances. If the builders truly weren't thinking about sound, why does this one room respond so dramatically to it? Above the king's chamber, hidden from anyone who doesn't crawl through cramped openings, are the so-called relieving spaces, low cavities stacked one over another. Officially, they exist to distribute weight and keep the ceiling from collapsing, and structurally that explanation works. But these spaces are granite too, with flat surfaces and enclosed volumes of their own. Some researchers suggest they interact acoustically with the chamber below, shifting how it responds, like extra strings on a musical instrument. Taken together, chamber and cavities form a vertical stack of eco-friendly boxes that seem to invite vibration. If they were purely structural, why do they also behave like parts of a carefully tuned system? Experiments inside the chamber show how sensitive the space really is. A clap, a spoken word, even the sound of footsteps can trigger faint echoes that flutter between the walls. When several people chant or sing together, the sound can become overwhelming, pressing on the ears and buzzing in the chest. Some visitors report a sense of disorientation, others a feeling of being lifted or pulled toward a trance. Is that just suggestion and atmosphere, or were the builders deliberately using sound to push people into altered states? If rituals were performed here, what exactly were they trying to do to the human body? There are bolder claims too. A few researchers compare the chamber's resonance to the behavior of a cavity in a machine, hinting at possibilities like energy focusing, vibration-based technology, or sound-driven processes. They point to the way granite conducts vibration and the way the pyramid's geometry channels forces downward and upward. Skeptics answer that there is no clear physical machinery here, no surviving devices that obviously link sound to a measurable output, but even they have to admit that, for a tomb, this room is strangely optimized for repetition, chanting, and focused ritual. It quietly challenges accepted history and raises questions that standard explanations don't quite close. None of this would work without stone that's been shaped to a high degree of precision. The walls wouldn't reflect sound so cleanly if they were rough. The joints wouldn't support massive vibrating beams if they were sloppy. The sarcophagus wouldn't ring if it were full of cracks and flaws. To create a singing chamber like this, the builders needed intimate control over how granite behaves under tools, under the chisel, the saw, and whatever else they were using. So as the last hum dies away in the king's chamber and the air falls still again, another question rises. If they could tune an entire room like a component, how did they learn to work stone with that kind of accuracy in the first place? To find that answer, we have to step back out of the pyramid's throat, into the sunlight, and follow the trail of these blocks all the way back to where they were born, into the quarries and early monuments where the tools, cuts, and drill marks on granite and diorite tell their own story of impossible precision. In quarries scattered along the Nile, there are blocks of granite weighing 50, 70, even 100 tons that were cut so cleanly that modern machinists stop and stare. On some, you can trace long, curved grooves that look like the path of a saw blade, not random chisel scratches. On others, drill cores show spiraling tool marks with a feed rate that seems closer to a factory floor than a Bronze Age worksite. How does a civilization that's supposed to be using simple copper tools leave behind stonework that feels like it belongs to an industrial age? Picture Aswan, over 800 kilometers south of Giza. The sun is harsh on the open rock, and the granite underfoot is so hard it can scratch steel. Here is where many of the great stones for temples and pyramids began their journey. Along the quarry face, channels cut into the bedrock follow straight lines and curves with walls that are surprisingly smooth. These aren't random gouges from trial and error. They look like someone knew exactly how deep to cut and exactly where each block needed to stop. If this was just rough extraction, why do the scars in the rock look more like the tracks of a controlled process than the mess of trial and error? One of the most telling clues comes from the way the blocks fit together once they left these quarries. At sites like Giza and elsewhere, huge stones are joined so tightly that the gaps between them are often less than a millimeter. In some cases, you can slide a thin blade along the joint and feel it stop almost immediately. Just two irregular blocks somehow worked until they meet with a precision you'd expect from machined metal. If all they had were stone hammers and soft copper, how did they achieve this kind of contact? Modern engineers and machinists who visit these places often react the same way. They aren't impressed by the age first. They're struck by the tolerances. People who spend decades working with lathes, mills, and surface grinders look at a cut through granite with a smooth, constant curve and say, "This shouldn't be possible with handheld chisels." They know how hard it is to hold a tool steady over long distances, especially in a material that fights back. What did the ancient quarrymen know that we don't? Then there are the drill cores. In museums and storage yards, you can find cylindrical pieces of stone where a hollow tool cut a circular path, leaving a spiral groove down the inside. The depth of each turn of that spiral doesn't look random. In some examples, it appears to advance several millimeters per revolution. That suggests a tool pressing downward with stable force while turning at a steady speed. Experiments with copper tubes and sand as an abrasive can make a hole, yes, but they don't reproduce those deep, regular spiral marks. So what kind of drill were the Egyptians actually using? Skeptics argue that we're overreading the evidence. They say copper tools, sand, patience, and thousands of workers are enough to explain everything we see. And it's true that simple tools, applied for a long time, can do impressive things. But what they can't easily explain are the specific patterns. The uniform feed visible in some drill cores, the repeated smoothness of long cuts, the way multiple surfaces across many sites all meet at the same kind of high precision. If this was just brute force and time, why do the marks look so controlled? Inside early monuments, the puzzle only deepens. Stone vases from the Step Pyramid complex, some made from hard igneous rock, show symmetry so perfect they look like they were spun on a lathe. The walls are thin, the curves repeat from one side to the other. To shape one of these by hand, with no rotating support and no measuring tools beyond the eye, would be almost impossible. Yet archaeologists have cataloged thousands, over 30,000 such vessels in some counts. How do you mass-produce that level of symmetry without some kind of guiding mechanism? Taken together, these details create cracks in the foundation of the simple story we're usually told. This isn't just about a few showpiece blocks crafted by master artisans while everyone else did rough work in mud brick. The precision appears again and again in quarries, in casing stones, in interior elements that no tourist ever sees. It suggests a tradition, a system, maybe even tools that helped ordinary workers produce extraordinary results. If that system existed, where is its record? Maybe it was never written down in the way we'd expect. Techniques can be passed from master to apprentice as habits of the hand, as rules of thumb, how to swing the hammer, how to brace a drill, where to listen for a certain sound in the stone. Over centuries, those habits can evolve into something that outsiders would recognize as a technology, even if the people using it don't call it that. And if that chain of teaching is ever broken, by drought, invasion, collapse, the knowledge can vanish, leaving only the finished work behind. How many entire crafts could disappear from history if all that remains are silent stones with no surviving manuals or tools? So we're left standing on the quarry floor, looking at smooth grooves, tight joints, and perfect curves cut into rock that resists every blow. The Sabu Disk and the resonant chamber inside the Great Pyramid start to look less like isolated miracles and more like symptoms of a deeper, hidden craft, a way of working stone that treated it almost like metal or wood. If this really was a coherent system of techniques, how far did it go, and what other abilities might it have included that we no longer see at all? But to really see how far this craft might have gone, we have to find a place where all of these traits come together in one structure. To do that, we head north again, toward a site that doesn't fit comfortably inside Egypt's usual styles, a sunken complex at Abydos. There, past later temples and carved walls, lies a granite puzzle half drowned in groundwater, built from blocks so massive and so out of place that many researchers feel they're looking at something inherited from an earlier world. If the quarries show us the tools, this monument may show us the finished machine. And if it does, what does that say about the kind of builders who first raised it and the world they might have lost? In 1902, excavators at Abydos cleared the rear of a New Kingdom temple and found something no one expected. 6 meters below the sand and groundwater, a hidden structure built from granite blocks weighing 40, 50, even 100 tons. It lay behind the elegant temple of Seti I, yet it didn't match his style at all. Where the upper temple is covered in fine reliefs and painted scenes, this buried complex is bare, brutal, and massive. It looks less like a shrine and more like the foundation of some heavy, unknown device. Why does a site tied to one of Egypt's most refined temples hide something that feels more like infrastructure than worship? To reach it, you have to look down. Today, the Osirian often sits in a shallow pool, its floor sunk below the modern ground level. Stairs descend along a stone passage, and as you move lower, the noise of the surface fades. The air grows cooler. Ahead, giant granite pillars rise out of the water, their sides rough but precise, their tops connected by lintels so big they could each crush a truck. This isn't delicate temple work. It feels like stepping into the engine room of ancient Egypt. The deeper you go, the more it feels as if you're entering a space that was meant to do work, not just tell stories. The layout is simple but strange. A central rectangular island stands in the middle, surrounded by a trench that can hold water. Around that, a ring of huge pillars supports the roof. There are no long corridors filled with stories, no endless rows of hieroglyphs explaining the rituals. Instead, you get a geometric space built from a handful of colossal pieces. It's as if the builders cared more about mass, balance, and geometry than decoration. What kind of ceremony needs a room like this? The official story links the Osirian to Seti I around 1300 BCE. His temple sits just to the east at a higher level, and some of the connecting corridors tie the two together. On that basis, many archaeologists simply label the Osirian a symbolic tomb for Osiris, an elegant underground echo of Seti's main sanctuary. The inscriptions we do see, added later on the surrounding walls, fit that idea. But then you look at the stonework itself, and the doubts begin. The masonry here is very different from the neat, smaller blocks of the upper temple. The Osirian's core stones are huge, irregular, and fit together with a tightness that reminds some people of the megalithic sites of Peru more than the standard Egyptian style. The blocks don't sit in neat courses, they interlock. Some joints are so close that you'd struggle to slide a sheet of paper between them. If this structure was designed at the same time as Seti's elegant halls, why does it look like it belongs to a different era? Then there's the weathering. Some researchers point to patterns on the lower stones, rounded edges, smoothed surfaces, and argue that they show signs of water erosion over a very long time. In a place that now sits well above the Nile's modern flood level, that raises questions. Did water once flow through this chamber more powerfully than the current groundwater seep? Was the Osirian exposed to weather long before Seti's temple was built? Skeptics argue the erosion can be explained by the high water table and centuries of soaking. But that doesn't fully answer why the style of construction feels so much older. If everything here truly belongs to Seti's age, Why do both the wear and the architecture seem to whisper of a deeper past? One controversial idea is that the Osirian predates Seti I by centuries, even millennia, and that the pharaoh simply discovered, restored, and repurposed it. The argument goes like this. When the 19th dynasty builders chose the site, they found an existing megalithic structure and decided to integrate it into their religious program. They added inscriptions, linked corridors, and a story about Osiris. But the core granite work, the machine-like heart of the place, was inherited. If that's true, then the Osirian becomes a bridge to an earlier, more enigmatic chapter of Egyptian building. It would turn this quiet pool into a rare survivor of a building tradition that official timelines don't easily accommodate, the kind of thing that just doesn't fit the narrative. Skeptics counter that there's no written record of such an inheritance, and that without inscriptions clearly stating an older date, we're reading too much into style and erosion. They see the Osirian as a deliberate archaic design, built in a primordial look to evoke deep time and myth. But what they can't easily explain are the practical details. Why use such massive stones when smaller ones would work? Why sink the structure so low, making it hard to access and prone to flooding? If it's just symbolic, why make it so physically extreme? Look again at that central island and surrounding trench. When water fills the basin, the pillars stand like supports around a flooded chamber, with the island as a raised platform in the center. Some people imagine rituals involving boats or processions wading through shallow water to reach the tomb of Osiris. Others see hints of hydraulic design, a system that might once have directed or controlled flows in a way we no longer understand. The combination of deep placement, water, and oversized stone makes it hard to shake the feeling that function came first and symbolism came later. The truth is, we don't know. But the combination of water, mass, and symmetry is hard to ignore. The sheer engineering here is impressive by any standard. Moving a single 80-ton block of granite from Aswan to Abydos, a distance of roughly 500 kilometers, then setting it precisely in a tight grid with others of similar size, demands a level of planning and control that still raises eyebrows today. This isn't just throwing big stones together, it's a coherent structure, carefully laid out so that its enormous components lock into a stable, balanced whole. What kind of workshop produced the skills needed for a place like this? Seen against the background of the Sabu Disk, the resonant king's chamber, and the precision stonework from the quarries, the Osirian starts to look like a showcase of that deeper craft. It's as if someone took all the quiet tricks of cutting, fitting, and handling stone and pushed them to an extreme in one hidden room. If later Egyptians inherited this place, it would mean they were walking among the remains of an older technology, weaving their own myths around a structure they didn't fully create. If that's the case, how many other religious spaces might actually be shells wrapped around machinery like cores we no longer recognize? And yet, even here, we catch only a frozen moment. The Osirian still stands, but it doesn't move. It doesn't show us how its builders cut, split, or transported those stones. To glimpse that process, we need to find a project that never reached completion. A moment where the ancient engineers were caught mid-task, their methods written directly onto the rock. For that, we have to leave Abydos behind and travel back to Aswan. There, in the open granite quarry, lies a stone needle over 40 meters long and weighing an estimated 1,200 tons, still attached to the bedrock. Along its sides, long scooped channels and unfinished cuts reveal an extraction method frozen in time. If the Osirian is the finished machine, the unfinished obelisk is the paused instruction manual. In a granite quarry at Aswan, dating back more than 3 millennia, lies a single piece of stone weighing an estimated 1,200 tons. If it had ever been raised, it would have been the largest obelisk Egypt ever stood, more than 40 meters long. But it never moved an inch. It cracked, and so it stayed where it was, half-formed, like a paused frame from an ancient construction film. How does a monument that failed become one of the clearest windows into Egypt's hidden engineering? The quarry itself is a bowl of hard pink granite, open to the sky. The unfinished obelisk dominates everything, still attached along its underside to the mother rock. 3 of its sides taper from a wide base to a sharp point, while the 4th still merges into raw bedrock. A clear reminder this giant was meant to be freed. It feels less like scenery and more like a massive experiment frozen mid-run. Along the sides of the trench around it, you can see long, scooped channels carved into the granite. Each scoop is a few centimeters deep, forming a repeating pattern that marches down the length of the stone. These channels show how workers cut under and around the obelisk, gradually isolating it from the quarry floor. The surfaces between the scoops are surprisingly regular, as if the tool moved in a consistent rhythm. Does this look like random pounding, or like a controlled method repeated thousands of times? The standard explanation is simple. Workers use dolerite hammerstones, round, hard rocks heavier than a bowling ball, to pound the granite stroke after stroke. Over time, they wore grooves into the stone, then widened and deepened them. But when you stand beside a 1,200-ton obelisk and imagine that every centimeter of its release was done by hand, one swing at a time, something about that story feels incomplete. Details like this don't fit the narrative of nothing but simple tools and brute force. Some of the channels curve inward with a smoothness that resembles the path of a mechanical cutter more than the scatter of hand blows. The trench floor doesn't look like chaotic damage. It looks like deliberate excavation, as if someone was reading the rock as they went. In places, the rock has been removed to within just a few centimeters of the underside of the obelisk, leaving a delicate stone web between the finished monument and freedom. How did they control their depth so carefully in such unforgiving stone? Then there's the crack. Along one section of the obelisk, the granite split, running deep into the body of the stone. This fracture is usually blamed for abandoning the project. The block could no longer be trusted to survive transport or raising. To us, the crack is a failure. To researchers, it's also a gift. It reveals the internal stresses in the rock and shows where the cutting approach might have pushed the material too far. If they misjudged it here, how many other times did they push just as hard and somehow succeed? Alternative researchers look at the unfinished obelisk and see evidence for more advanced methods. They point to the regularity of the scoops and suggest large, guided tools to carve those channels more efficiently than individual hammer blows. Skeptics argue that no trace of such machines has been found, and that dolerite pounding, plus sand and time, can account for the grooves. But if the process was so basic, why does it leave behind patterns that seem almost mechanical? Beyond the cutting, the logistics raise their own questions. A 1,200-ton block is not just heavy, it's at the edge of what even modern cranes would struggle with. Most standing obelisks we know, like the Lateran obelisk in Rome at about 455 tons, are far smaller. Yet the quarrymen at Aswan clearly intended to move this monster. They meant to free it, slide it from the pit, haul it roughly 200 kilometers down the Nile, and stand it upright without breaking it. One mistake in that chain would have shattered years of work in seconds. Were they really betting all of that on guesswork with no tested system behind it? The fact that they attempted it at all suggests a confidence born from previous success. You don't reach for a 1,200-ton obelisk as your first big project. You work your way up, building a body of experience with smaller monuments, 100 tons, 200 tons, 400 tons, each one teaching you more about how granite behaves and where the limits are. In that sense, the unfinished obelisk isn't just a failure. It's the visible edge of a learning curve that we barely understand. How much vanished experimentation is hidden behind this one visible mistake? Seen this way, the unfinished obelisk becomes more than just a cracked stone in a quarry. It's a rare chance to watch the ancient engineers mid-action, their method exposed in the channels, the fracture, and the positioning of the block. It hints at builders who were not only priests serving the gods, but practical problem solvers pushing materials to their limits. Yet all of this power was focused on raw stone, shaping it, moving it, raising it. What happens when that same mindset turns to the symbols carved into the stone and to the way those symbols interact with light? Because while Aswan's quarry is open to the sun and the sound of tools, far to the north there is another kind of workshop. Under the dim ceilings of Denderi, craftsmen carved shapes into the walls that some people see as flowers and others see as glowing devices. If the unfinished obelisk shows us how Egypt tried to master mass and motion, the reliefs at Dendera may hint at an attempt to master illumination itself. So we leave the cracked giant behind and step into the shadows, where stone no longer just stands or falls, it seems to light up. In the late 1990s, a small group of researchers built a glass tube based on a carving from a 2,000-year-old Egyptian temple. When they ran a current through it, the tube glowed with a cold, pale light. No flame, no smoke. It came from the walls of Dendera, not from a modern lab manual. How does an image carved around 50 BCE end up behaving like a piece of electrical equipment? To find that carving, you leave the bright courtyard and move into the shadowed halls of the Dendera complex. The ceiling hangs low, the air feels heavy, and rows of columns close in around you as the light fades. But in a cramped side crypt that was sealed for centuries, something different waits on the stone. Why is the most unusual scene hidden where almost no ordinary visitor would ever stand? On that wall is the relief at the heart of the argument. A long, oval shape stretches nearly 2 meters, swelling like a bulb and narrowing to a neck. Inside it, a snake curves in a way that looks disturbingly like a filament inside glass. One end of this bulb rests on a pedestal often compared to an insulator, while a thick, ribbed jed pillar seems to support it from below. Is this really just a lotus and a mythic serpent, or are we seeing light captured in stone? The official reading is clear. Egyptologists say the oval is the womb of the sky goddess, the serpent is life force, the jed is stability, and the whole thing is a layered cosmic metaphor. In that view, it's all symbol, no circuitry. But engineers and electricians notice something else. The proportions echo a Crookes tube or early discharge lamp, right down to the supporting base and inner filament. When experts from two fields look at the same carving and see two incompatible realities, which one should we believe? Those European experimenters tried to escape that stalemate. Using the relief as a guide, they built a glass vessel several tens of centimeters long, pumped out most of the air, and connected it to a high-voltage source. Inside, a faint but very real glow appeared, an electrical discharge similar to the light in early laboratory tubes. That doesn't prove Dendera was wired for power, but it does force a question. Why does a supposed lotus flower diagram double as a working electric lamp design? Skeptics reply that you can make almost any evacuated tube glow if you push enough voltage through it. They add that there is no trace of copper wiring in the temple walls, no power stations, no infrastructure that looks like an electrical grid. All of that weighs heavily against the idea of a fully electrified sanctuary. Yet one practical issue still sits unsolved. How did the builders light long corridors and crypts without filling them with smoke? We know the Egyptians used oil lamps and open flames, and those leave residue. They blacken stone. Still, some inner chambers are much cleaner than we'd expect after centuries of torchlight. Some researchers suggest polished metal mirrors bounced sunlight deep indoors, but each reflection loses most of the light, often more than 90% after only a few bounces. Could such a fragile chain of reflections really have lit carvings many meters from any natural daylight? Supporters of the Dendera light idea say the reliefs are more than metaphors, that they're a visual blueprint for solving that lighting problem. They point to how the figures seem to carry and present the devices, almost like technicians holding equipment instead of priests holding symbols. If this is purely symbolic, it's an odd choice to repeat in a hidden crypt instead of on grand outer walls. Why place your strangest cosmic imagery where almost nobody was meant to see it? Timing adds to the tension. In our modern story, practical electric light belongs to the late 19th century. The first reliable incandescent bulbs are just over 140 years old. Yet here, in a temple finished more than 2,000 years ago, we find an image that people instantly compare to a lamp. Maybe the resemblance is coincidence. Symbols can accidentally look like later inventions. But when a symbol also works as a device when copied, it doesn't fit the narrative quite as neatly as we've been taught. Skeptics respond that even limited electrical tricks should leave traces: burnt contacts, carbon deposits, fittings designed for repeated use. They note that no such clear evidence has been documented at Dendera. But the counterpoint is simple. The absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially in a building that's been looted, repainted, cleaned, and repaired for nearly 2 millennia. If a specialized priesthood guarded that knowledge, how much would survive outside the images they controlled? Whether you see a lotus or a light bulb, the Dendera relief exposes something deeper about how we read the past. Our expectations filter what we allow ourselves to see. If we assume advanced technology never existed, we file anything that hints at it under myth. If we assume the ancients knew far more than we think, we see devices where others see symbols. Somewhere between those extremes lies the real story, still locked in stone. How many other carvings quietly dismissed by scholars might hold double meanings like this? And even if every scene at Dendera is completely symbolic, one thing is clear. The Egyptians were comfortable encoding complex ideas about energy, light, and flow into their art. That mindset makes it easier to imagine a culture that also watched other invisible forces just as closely. To test that idea, we leave the temple and return to Giza, where modern scientists no longer stare only at the surface of stone. Using cosmic ray muons, they've revealed a hidden void above the Grand Gallery that no inscription mentions, a find that raises new questions. In 2017, a team of physicists announced a hidden space inside the Great Pyramid, a void at least 30 meters long floating above the Grand Gallery. They didn't drill, blast, or move a single stone. Instead, they used particles born in exploding stars to see through millions of tons of limestone and granite. How does a monument built 4,500 years ago still reveal new rooms in the age of particle physics? To understand what they did, picture the pyramid as a patient under a scanner. High above, cosmic rays slam into Earth's atmosphere, creating tiny particles called muons that rain down at nearly the speed of light. Most pass straight through stone, but some are absorbed or deflected when they hit something dense. By placing detectors in known chambers and counting muons for months, scientists built a kind of X-ray of the structure. Why aim such a high-tech tool at a tomb we thought was already mapped? Every new scan seems to raise more questions than it answers. The project, Scan Pyramids, set up instruments in the Queen's chamber and outside the pyramid. Over time, billions of muons passed through the stone and into the detectors. Most of the data matched what we already knew. Solid where there should be solid, gaps where passages appear on old diagrams. But in one region above the Grand Gallery, the pattern broke. There was a clear excess of muons, like a bright patch on a medical scan. More muons meant less stone, and less stone meant empty space. It's as if the pyramid itself is quietly refusing to match our neat diagrams. This big void, as the team cautiously named it, is not small. Early estimates suggest a length similar to the Grand Gallery itself, around 30 meters, and a cross-section large enough for a person to walk through. It's not a hairline crack or a narrow joint between blocks. It is a volume high inside the pyramid in a place no ancient text mentions. How does a space that size stay hidden in the world's most studied monument? At first, some wondered if the signal was a mistake. Maybe it was detector noise, miscalibration, or some subtle effect in the stone. But the void appeared in data from different detectors in different positions using different technologies. Each method pointed to the same hidden region. When independent tools converge on the same anomaly, it becomes hard to dismiss. If the void is real, what could it be? One cautious idea is that it's a relieving space, a cavity built to reduce pressure on the Grand Gallery below. The pyramid already uses such cavities above the king's chamber, 5 low spaces stacked like hidden attics to spread the load. Maybe the builders used a similar trick here, but that explanation raises its own questions. If it's purely structural, why is there no obvious access? The structure starts to feel less like a static tomb and more like a puzzle built to mislead. Others speculate that the void might be a hidden corridor, a second Grand Gallery, or a sealed chamber for rituals we no longer understand. In that view, it could hold symbolic objects, tools, or even writings we've never seen. Skeptics argue we're letting our imaginations run loose, that empty spaces don't automatically mean treasure. But they can't yet explain why, in a structure whose internal layout seems so deliberate, such a large volume would exist without a clear role. The discovery also shows how confident we were about something we barely knew. For more than a century, diagrams of the Great Pyramid have shown the same few passageways, descending and ascending tunnels, the Grand Gallery, the King's and Queen's chambers. Yet the muon data cuts through that certainty. If one void of this size can still surprise us, how many smaller details are still hiding in the stone? Each new anomaly chips away at the comfort of the tidy textbook story. Officially, the answer to why no one has entered it is safety and preservation. Any attempt to reach the void could crack blocks, weaken supports, or upset the balance inside the pyramid. No team wants to be remembered for causing lasting harm. But there is another, quieter tension here, the fear that whatever lies inside might challenge the neat royal tomb story. What happens if we find something that doesn't fit the narrative? Even if the void is empty, its existence alone challenges accepted history. It shows that the builders were comfortable creating complex internal structures we still don't fully understand, hidden behind layers of stone. It hints that the pyramid may contain features not meant for public eyes or even for later generations. Was this a secret known only to a small circle of architects and priests, lost when their line ended? Seen through muons, the Great Pyramid no longer looks like a simple triangle with a few straight tunnels. It appears more like a layered device, with cavities, stress-relieving spaces, and resonant rooms interacting in ways we're only beginning to model. That doesn't prove it was a machine, but it does make it harder to see it as just a pile of blocks. If we could peel back the stone like a shell, would the inner pattern feel more like architecture or like engineering? If this is only a tomb, it is working very hard to hide the simplest parts of itself. For now, the void above the Grand Gallery hangs there in darkness, a question mark carved into rock. It doesn't show its purpose. It doesn't reveal who ordered it built or why no inscription records it. It simply sits, quietly breaking the diagrams we thought were complete. And if a hidden space can lurk in the heart of the Great Pyramid, what might be waiting in the bedrock only a short walk away? Because on the same plateau, another riddle has stared at us for thousands of years. The body of a lion with a human face carved from natural rock. Around its flanks, erosion patterns, blocked shafts, and hints of tunnels suggest that its real story may lie below the sand, not above it. So we step away from the pyramid's invisible chamber, cross the plateau and stand before the Great Sphinx to ask a new question. What, if anything, is hidden beneath the Lion of Stone? From nose to tail, the Great Sphinx stretches about 73 meters across the Giza Plateau. Yet, for most of its life, it was buried up to its neck in sand. Only the head and a small part of the chest were visible when early travelers described it. The rest of the body sat hidden in a trench, worn and shielded at the same time by centuries of wind-blown grains. How do you judge the true age and history of a monument when you've barely seen its skin? Stand in front of it now, with the sand cleared away, and a different story comes into view. The head looks relatively crisp, the facial features worn but still readable. The body, in contrast, is heavily weathered. Deep vertical grooves run down the sides of the enclosure, cutting through the limestone like channels carved by falling water. If all of this damage came only from wind and sand, why do parts of the Sphinx enclosure look more like the work of rain? That's the heart of one of Giza's most persistent arguments. Some geologists, looking at those rounded profiles and vertical flutings, say they resemble rainfall erosion more than desert abrasion. They note that heavy, sustained rain in this region is thought to have ended thousands of years before the conventional date for the Sphinx, around 2500 BCE. If they're right, then the body may have been exposed to a climate older than the pyramid age itself. Does that mean the Lion of Stone could be far older than the face that crowns it? Some of these geological warnings have been quietly dismissed by scholars, but the rock itself keeps arguing for a deeper past. Skeptics argue that the patterns can be explained by other processes: rising and falling groundwater, salt crystallization, subtle shifts in the rock layers. But even they admit that the enclosure has weathered differently from nearby structures. When two monuments, only a few hundred meters apart, age in such different ways, what does that say about their history? The mysteries aren't only on the surface. For more than a century, workers and visitors around the Sphinx have reported cavities, passages, and hollow sounds beneath their feet. Early photographs show pits and shafts near its paws and along the sides of the enclosure wall. Over time, stories grew of tunnels leading toward the pyramids, of chambers under the monument, of doorways cut and then quietly closed. How many of those stories are rumor, and how many are fragments of something real? In the late 20th century, teams using ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys scanned the area around the Sphinx. Their plots hinted at anomalies, zones where the rock reflected signals differently or where the ground seemed less dense than expected. A few of these lined up with known shafts. Others did not. In maps published at the time, shaded shapes beneath and in front of the monument suggested possible voids a few meters to a few tens of meters across. Were these natural pockets in the limestone, or rooms carved and then forgotten? Official statements usually strike a careful tone. Some surveys are acknowledged, while others are dismissed as flawed or inconclusive. Excavations have been carried out in certain spots, revealing small tunnels and maintenance passages, then halted in others with little public explanation. The reason given is almost always the same: preservation and stability. Those are real concerns, but when shafts are capped, doors sealed, and questions left hanging, is it any surprise that speculation grows? Silence in a place built to broadcast power always feels like part of the mystery. Among the most persistent legends is the idea of a chamber between the Sphinx's paws. Visitors can see a stele there, placed by a pharaoh who claimed he was granted kingship in a dream beneath the lion's head. Below and behind that stone, some believe there is a deeper space, perhaps linked to vertical shafts cut into the bedrock. Skeptics point out that inspections have shown nothing like a great archive or vault. Yet whenever work begins in that zone, rumors flare. Why are we always told so little about what lies under the monument's front? What makes all of this more intriguing is the way the monument itself blends different elements. The head is likely recarved. The proportions suggest it may once have been larger, perhaps a lion's head later reshaped into a human face. The body is carved directly from the natural bedrock, while parts of the paws and surrounding walls are made from added blocks. It's a layered structure, altered and maintained over many centuries. If the face is younger than the body, then the monument is already a story written across more than one age. If the visible form is a palimpsest, how many earlier versions might be hiding below ground level? As we consider tunnels, chambers, and erosion lines, a broader pattern begins to emerge. Again and again in Egypt, the biggest secrets are not in the open courtyards, but in the parts no one was meant to see. Under floors, behind false walls, inside sealed corridors. At Giza, Muon, scans have now shown us a hidden void inside the Great Pyramid, and surveys whisper of hollow places around the Sphinx. If the builders were willing to hide entire rooms in stone and bedrock, what else might they have hidden in plain sight? Because there is another way to conceal information that leaves no empty space at all. Instead of digging chambers, you can fold meaning into numbers, into angles, ratios, and positions that look normal until someone starts measuring. If the Sphinx raises questions about what lies beneath a single monument, the pyramids raise questions about what might be encoded in the very shape of the plateau. So from the Lion of Stone, we lift our eyes to the lines and slopes around it and start to ask, are the angles themselves trying to tell us something? In 2023, surveyors put the latitude of the Great Pyramid Center at about 29.9792 degrees north. The speed of light in a vacuum is 299,792,458 meters per second. Those two numbers sit so close together that for some people this 4,500-year-old monument suddenly looks less like a tomb and more like a code. Is that just a coincidence of geography or a hint that the builders were playing with patterns far beyond simple stonework? Step back and look at the pyramid not as a pile of blocks but as a set of clean measurements. Each side of its base is about 230 meters long in its original form, forming a perimeter of roughly 920 meters. Its original height was around 146.6 meters. If you take the perimeter and divide it by twice the height, you get a value close to 3.14. That's pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. Why should a square-based monument on the Giza Plateau echo the geometry of a perfect circle? The usual answer is that pi appears naturally when practical builders try to create stable slopes. If you experiment with angles and heights, you might stumble into a proportion that happens to approximate pi without ever writing the symbol down. That is possible. But here, the approximation is surprisingly tight, close enough that some researchers see intentional design. If they were only chasing stability, why did they land on a set of numbers that seems to wrap a circle's logic around a square? The pyramid's famous slope adds another layer. Its face rises at about 51.8 degrees. If you look at the ratio between half the base and the height, you get a number close to 1.618. That's the golden ratio, a value that appears in spirals, growth patterns, and later architecture. Skeptics argue that, again, this could be an accident of choosing a pleasant angle that happens to hit that ratio. But at what point do multiple neat coincidences start to feel like a deliberate pattern? Some see this as a kind of numerical language. In their view, height, base, and slope weren't just practical choices. They were carefully tuned so that one monument could echo several fundamental constants at once. Perimeter to height whispers pi. Height to half base hints at the golden ratio. Latitude seems to nod toward the speed of light. It's as if stone, distance, and angle are all being used to say the same thing in different ways. If that's true, who was meant to read it? There's another claim that puts the pyramid on a planetary scale. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by a factor of 43,200, you get a number close to Earth's polar radius in meters. Do the same with its base perimeter, and you approach Earth's equatorial circumference. Critics point out that ancient Egyptians didn't leave behind clear records of global surveying. But what they can't fully answer is how a single building, scaled up by a simple number, ends up shadowing the size of the planet so closely. Maybe this is all pattern seeking. The human brain is excellent at finding connections, even where none were intended. Given enough measurements and enough constants, some of them will line up. But there is a flip side. If a culture did encode knowledge in ratios and angles, we would only ever see it as a series of coincidences unless they told us outright. In a world where myths and numbers blurred, why would they label their secrets in the way we expect? Not every proposed code holds up. Some writers force the math, choosing rounded values, mixing units, or ignoring error bars to make the numbers dance. Those attempts weaken the case. Yet a core set of relationships keeps coming back in independent surveys. The pi-like perimeter-to-height ratio, the near-golden slope, the tight cardinal alignment of the sides, within a fraction of a degree of true north, south, east, and west. Together, they paint a picture of builders who had a very firm grip on geometry and orientation. Does that level of control really match the image of people fumbling with primitive tools? Skeptics argue that good orientation and practical geometry are well within the reach of ancient surveyors using simple instruments and careful observation of the sky. They're right about that. A sighting rod, a cord, and the North Star can give you impressive results. But even if we grant that, it doesn't erase the deeper question. Why go to such extreme lengths to lock so many precise relationships into a single structure if your only goal is to bury a king? These patterns start to feel less like accidents and more like clues to how the builders saw their world. A monument that mirrors Earth's shape in miniature suggests a culture thinking in global terms, even if they never walked all its coasts. A slope that folds pi and the golden ratio into a single angle suggests minds comfortable with abstract relationships, not just rule-of-thumb construction. For a story that treats this as a simple royal tomb, these numbers are quiet cracks in the foundation. If their stones carried this much numerical structure, what were they really trying to align with? To answer that, you only need to wait for the sun to set. As daylight fades, the crisp lines of the pyramid become silhouettes, and the sky behind them fills with stars. Night after night, year after year, the same constellations rise and wheel above the plateau. If the numbers in the stone hint at a deliberate design, it makes sense to ask whether that design reaches upward. So we let the math fade into the background, lift our gaze above the dark edges of the pyramid, and see what happens when these ancient lines are compared not to our textbooks, but to the patterns written in the sky. In 1994, a pair of researchers overlaid a star map of Orion's belt onto a plan of Giza and noticed something unsettling. The three main pyramids and the three bright belt stars seemed to match in both shape and offset. The detail that caught their attention was small, the way one point is slightly out of line with the other two. On the ground and in the sky, the same mistake appears. Is that a trick of pattern-seeking minds, or the fingerprint of a plan that joined Earth to the stars? To feel the force of that question, you have to imagine Giza at night, not as it is now, ringed by streetlights, but as it was 4,000 years ago. After sunset, there would have been almost no artificial light for kilometers around. The pyramids would have become black silhouettes, and above them, thousands of stars would have burned with a clarity we rarely see today. For the people who lived here, the sky wasn't background decoration. It was a clock, a calendar, and a storybook all at once. Why wouldn't they want that story anchored in stone? The Orion idea starts simple. The three great pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkara, are not placed in a perfect straight line. Menkara, the smallest, is offset toward the Nile. In the constellation, Mintaka, the faintest of the belt stars, is offset in the same direction. The angles are not a perfect match, but they're close enough that when you see the two patterns side by side, it's hard not to feel a jolt of recognition. Is that level of resemblance expected if the builders were only thinking in terms of flat, empty land? Supporters go further. In Egyptian belief, Orion was linked to Osiris, Lord of Death and Renewal. If that connection is genuine, then aligning royal tombs with Orion isn't just pretty geometry, it's theology in stone. The king's resting place would literally be built inside the outline of the god he hoped to join. Skeptics argue that with 88 constellations and dozens of monuments, some combinations will always line up. But even they admit that the Giza layout is one of the more striking examples of sky and ground symmetry anywhere in the ancient world. Inside the Great Pyramid, the sky seems to intrude more directly. From the so-called king's and queen's chambers, narrow shafts just 20 centimeters wide angle up toward the exterior. They are too small for a person to crawl through and far too precise to be random cracks. When their orientations are projected back to around 2500 BCE, they point toward key stars, Orion's belt, Sirius, and circumpolar stars that never set. Why carve real tunnels through tens of meters of solid stone if the directions they point in didn't matter? One answer is symbolic. These shafts gave the pharaoh's soul a path to rise and join the stars. But if symbolism was all they needed, those paths could have been drawn or described. The choice to fix them physically, with angles measured and cut into the fabric of the monument, suggests something more like engineering. Careful, repeatable, and intentional. Were they building a kind of celestial address? Locking coordinates into the stone so that every future night sky would still match the original design? These alignments aren't limited to Giza. At Karnak, more than 600 kilometers to the south, the Great Temple complex stretches along an axis that catches the rising sun at specific times of the year. On certain dates, the light travels down its length and strikes deep into the sanctuary, illuminating inner walls for just a few minutes. Other temples line up with solstices and with the heliacal rising of Sirius, which signaled the annual Nile flood. In some cases, the alignments are accurate to within a fraction of a degree. How many dawns did they have to watch to dial that in? Skeptics point out that any farming civilization will pay attention to the sun and stars, and that practical needs can explain a lot of these choices. If you depend on a flood that arrives roughly every 365 days, you'll map the sky to predict it. That much is true. But what stands out in Egypt is the scale. Entire complexes, hundreds of meters long, built over centuries, act as giant pointers aimed at one sunrise, one star, one celestial moment. That feels less like convenience and more like obsession. Seen together, the patterns are hard to ignore. Stones cut with incredible precision, interiors tuned to resonate at specific frequencies, hidden voids that look like sealed compartments, temples that light up only at exact moments in the year. And across all of it, alignments that tie these structures to constellations and cycles in the sky. Even if you explain each piece in isolation, the system as a whole still raises questions. Were these builders simply very skilled masons, or custodians of a worldview that saw earth, stone, and star as parts of one machine? That question leads us beyond Egypt's borders, because on other high places, far from the Nile, there are sites where megalithic pillars suddenly appear around 9500 BCE, then are buried and forgotten. Their style, massive stones, precise carving, animals and symbols arranged in careful bands, feels eerily like a prelude to what we see later along the Nile. As we lay Egypt's alignments next to those older echoes and add theories of sudden global upheaval like the Younger Dryas impact, another possibility takes shape. that the hidden technology of Egypt might not be the first chapter of the story at all, but one of the last surviving pages. About 12,800 years ago, the planet jolted. Ice cores from Greenland show a sudden spike of soot and strange particles at the start of the Younger Dryas. As the Ice Age ended, sea levels climbed more than 60 meters, swallowing huge stretches of coastline. If early centers of knowledge stood along those drowned shores, how much would we ever see today? That thought follows you down the steps into the Osirian at Abydos. Here, about 8 meters below the ground, granite blocks, some between 50 and 100 tons, form a sunken hall. Above it, at a higher level, stands the Temple of Seti I from around 1300 BCE, layered with fine reliefs and dense hieroglyphs. Officially, the lower structure is explained as a New Kingdom construction in an archaic style. Yet when you stand between those giant pillars, it doesn't feel like imitation, it feels like something inherited. Water deepens the impression. The Osirian's floor often lies under a shallow pool, and the lowest courses show prolonged contact with rising groundwater, as if the landscape has shifted around it over a very long time. If this were just a back room added to Seti's temple, why does it sit so low, so worn, and so different from the building above? On the Giza Plateau, the Sphinx enclosure raises similar doubts. The famous head has been reworked, but the walls around the body tell their own story. Deep vertical channels and softly rounded shapes cut down through the limestone. Some geologists argue that this pattern looks like the work of heavy rainfall over long periods. Rainfall that, according to climate records, belonged to a much wetter era thousands of years before 2500 BCE. If they're right, the lion-bodied core of the Sphinx could date back to a climate that no pharaoh ever saw. Critics point out that groundwater, salt, and centuries of erosion can also scar rock in complex ways. But even setting exact dates aside, the pattern remains odd. At Abydos, the deepest stonework is the roughest and most massive. The refined temple is on top. At Giza, the most worn surfaces cradle the oldest part of the Sphinx, while later repairs are sharper. In both places, it feels like younger constructions have been draped over a core that may already have been ancient. Far to the north, on a hill in southeastern Turkey, another anomaly appears. At Göbekli Tepe, circular enclosures with T-shaped pillars up to 6 meters tall and weighing around 20 tons were built as early as 9,600 BCE. The pillars are carved with foxes, snakes, vultures, and abstract symbols. By our normal timeline, this is thousands of years before cities or kings. Yet someone coordinated quarrying, transport, carving, and ritual at a high level. And then, after centuries, they carefully buried their own work under tons of fill, as if sealing away a whole era on purpose. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7,000. It sits just after the Younger Dryas chaos, right at the dawn of settled life. If people at that time could already raise and decorate dozens of 20-ton stones, then the line between simple foragers and advanced builders starts to blur. What else might that? This is the space where more radical ideas move in. Writers like Graham Hancock and engineers like Christopher Dunn suggest that structures such as the Osirian, the Sphinx enclosure, and even parts of the Giza complex may carry echoes of knowledge from a civilization badly damaged at the end of the Ice Age. In their view, survivors took fragments of astronomy, engineering, and myth into safer regions like the Nile Valley. Over generations, those fragments were rebuilt into systems we now attribute wholly to dynastic Egypt. It's a version of history with not just one rise, but a rise, a fall, and a partial recovery. Mainstream archaeologists strongly resist that picture. They can point to clear sequences along the Nile, small farming villages around 4000 BCE, then regional chiefs, then unified kings, writing, and large state projects by about 3000 BCE. From their perspective, you don't need a lost world to explain Egypt's skill. Patient, local development is enough. They are right that evidence has to ground any story. Still, even inside their timelines, they live with a few stubborn data points. A megalithic Osirian that looks older than it should, a Sphinx enclosure whose erosion keeps raising questions, and Göbekli Tepe's great pillars standing thousands of years earlier than expected. Taken one at a time, each of these can be softened, explained, or filed under interesting but not decisive. Taken together, they begin to feel like cracks in the foundation of our neat, linear story. Cracks that hint at the possibility that human culture has climbed higher, earlier than we've been comfortable admitting, and that some of what we call hidden technology in Egypt might be the last echo of experiments begun long before the first pharaoh carved his name in stone. If so, what else could be waiting in places we've barely touched? If that's even partly true, then the most important evidence may not lie in some undiscovered ruin. It may be sealed inside the monuments we already know, under the paws of the Sphinx, inside unexplored voids above the Grand Gallery, beneath the floors of sunken structures like the Osirian. And that leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. If so many signs already challenge accepted history, why do the places most likely to hold answers, the tunnels, voids, and sealed chambers, remain so tightly controlled, so rarely explored in full? As the ghosts of a forgotten age gather around these stones, the next step in the story is no longer about what we think might have happened before the pharaohs. It is about why, even now, we hesitate to dig all the way down to find out. For more than 5,000 years, the great stones of Egypt have watched the Nile rise and fall. Only in the last few decades have we learned how to look through them instead of just at them, using muon scans, ground-penetrating radar, and ultra-precise surveys. Inside those three-dimensional maps, details keep appearing that don't sit neatly in the textbook story. How many exceptions can a history carry before it admits something important is missing? Think of what we've already seen. A fragile stone Sabu Disk from around 30,000 BCE, shaped less like a bowl and more like a turbine. Granite vases and cores turned with tolerances finer than a human hair. A 1,200-ton obelisk at Aswan, lying half-cut in the quarry, its scooped channels looking disturbingly like the tracks of a guided tool. None of this proves advanced machines, but each piece quietly defies explanation with simple copper chisels and sand. Then there are the places that feel less like shrines and more like foundations for something heavy. The Osirian at Abydos, sunk several meters below today's ground level, built from multi-ton blocks that don't match the temple standing above. A 30-meter void above the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid, revealed by cosmic ray muons in a zone no ancient text mentions. Tunnels and hinted-at chambers around the Sphinx, some sealed, some filled, some simply left alone. Why do so many of the strangest clues sit exactly where we still haven't truly gone? Light and symbol deepen the unease. In the shadowed halls of Dendera, reliefs that Egyptologists call lotus flowers and mythic scenes look to some engineers like glass bulbs, cables, and power sources, and experimental replicas have produced real light from similar shapes. In the Great Pyramid, narrow shafts aim with unnerving accuracy toward Orion's belt and circumpolar stars, as if the stone itself were fixed to a stellar address. Across the country, temples and pyramids catch solstices and key star risings within a fraction of a degree, while the Great Pyramid's proportions echo pi and scale uncannily well to Earth's size. Is it really satisfying to wave all this away as coincidence and ornament? If even part of this picture is true, then the most important evidence may not lie in some undiscovered city. It may be sealed in places we already know by name, inside that 30-meter void above the Grand Gallery, in any unopened chamber beneath the Sphinx, under the deepest courses of structures like the Osirion, behind still-blocked doors in narrow shafts. The tools to reach them already exist: fiber optic cameras slipping through holes the width of a finger, tiny drills that can core through stone without collapsing a wall. The question is no longer, can we look? It's, why don't we? There are reasonable answers. These monuments are fragile. Tourism is vital. Politics, funding, and professional rivalries all tug on what can and cannot be done. One careless tunnel could crack a chamber or scar an irreplaceable surface. Caution is understandable. But when access is tightest around the anomalies that raise the biggest questions, when scans are announced but follow-up is postponed again and again, another feeling begins to grow. Is this only about protection, or also about controlling what kind of past we're allowed to see? If a sealed space under the Sphinx, or inside the Great Pyramid, or beneath some forgotten hall were opened and found to hold something truly unexpected, maps from an unknown age, inscriptions that don't fit any known script, devices whose purpose we can't easily explain, the shock wouldn't stop at Egyptology. It would ripple through our sense of human memory itself and show how much can be lost in a single flood, a single impact, a few centuries of chaos. It would expose just how thin and fragile the story we call history really is. That possibility is why some feel these clues don't fit the narrative. Not because a single grand theory has been proved, but because systems built on fixed timelines are naturally uncomfortable with evidence that opens deep questions. It's easier to label anomalies as fringe, to file them under already explained, than to admit that, in key places, the data still outpaces the model. Yet this is exactly where curiosity is supposed to lean in, not turn away. Why isn't this taught as an open field of inquiry rather than a tidy story with a few oddities pushed to the margins? So we're left with a quiet choice. We can see the Sabu Disk, the Osirion, the hidden voids, the Sphinx's scars, the Dendera reliefs, the alignments and numbers as nothing more than the noise of an ordinary civilization amplified by imagination. Or we can accept that they form a small but stubborn cluster of facts that remains unexplained, not debunked, not neatly resolved, just waiting. As this journey comes to an end, you don't need to decide which view is right. You don't have to solve the Sabu Disk or picture exactly what might lie in a chamber no one has entered for thousands of years. It's enough to feel how much of our past is still in shadow, and how many real discoveries may still be locked behind a single blocked doorway or under a few meters of undisturbed rock. So let your thoughts loosen, like dust settling in a quiet corridor. Picture the pyramids under the night sky, the Sphinx half in shadow, the cool, still air of hidden halls. Whatever secrets they hold will wait. For now, let the questions hang there, soft and unresolved, at the edge of your awareness, an open door in the dark. And as the sounds of this story fade, allow yourself to drift away from the puzzles and into your own quiet, carrying one simple thought, that the world you woke up in may be standing on a history far older and far stranger than we have ever been taught.